to the second Walsall Seminar of the term. Kate Leader from the University of York. Kate is one of the few people in the world who has a PhD in law and a PhD in performance studies. And has previously taught at LSE and at Birkbeck, and has an interest in performance in its relationship to criminal justice, and is especially interested in victims who represent themselves in court, I think, both internationally and domestically. So you've come to hear her, not me. So without further ado, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll put the timer on so I don't outstay my welcome. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. And I'm obviously going to be talking about the theatre of the trial. So this work starts with this first PhD I did at the Department of Performance Studies at the University of Sydney. And I wrote a PhD about the role of performance in the adversarial criminal trial. And I was a theatre and performance studies academic for a number of years before I crossed to the dark side and joined legal academia and did another PhD in law. But my work kind of naturally straddles both disciplines. I am basically incapable of writing anything that doesn't draw on performance and theatre studies, because I think it's just completely within me. So I'm very pleased to be able to share some of the things that I think make them natural disciplines to have dialogue with each other, that I think that there is a value in it. So, topic of my paper today, the theatre of the trial, but I have a subtitle / caveat. Oh, it's not working. Hang on a second. There we go. From the sublime to the tedious, to say that to me, these disciplines can meet and can inform each other in really rich and fulfilling ways, but not all of it does that. And I think you get a variety of quality of comparisons. It's a really common thing, I think, to compare the theatre and the criminal trial. It's not always that helpful, but it's always interesting to do. And I always think that sometimes it can be met with an eye roll. And I always find it interesting to tell people that I look at theatre and the trial, because I think you get a range of interesting reactions. I think it's, sometimes with my students, a lot of them say, well, obviously, you get a lot of that. You get, well, obviously, the trial is a theatre. And I think if you push people on it, they might struggle to articulate in more detail what they mean. So you might get something about, they're acting, or there's costumes, or there's a stage or something. And I think those kind of resemblances can be useful, but they often don't take you particularly far. So I mean, that's sort of where we go with that one. I think the most common reaction that's negative is an uneasiness about it, that there is something frivolous about comparing the criminal trial to a form of theatre, a sort of a deep unease or anxiety around the comparison of law to the theatrical. I have wondered if that's why law and theatre and law and performance hasn't taken off as a subfield in the way that law and literature has, the way law and emotion has, because there are people like me who've been doing this for 50, I haven't been doing for 50 years, just to clarify that. But people have been writing on this, relationship, certainly at least since the 1970s, and depending on how you couch it, possibly a lot longer than that. I do think there's momentum, but it hasn't really seemed to have coalesced. And I do think that I'm going to spend a bit of time diagnosing this unease and this anxiety to see if that kind of explains it a bit. So Peter Goodrich writes, law is a literature that denies its literary qualities. So we might today say that law and legal process is a theatre or a form of performance that tends to deny its performative and theatrical qualities. So start there. So I want to do two things today, split it into two halves. So in the first half, I want to go into this theatricality. So what do legal agents, legal professionals mean when they say theatrical? So it gets deployed a lot. What does the metaphor do? What kind of work is it doing? So I'm going to suggest there are two rough directions that kind of that emerge. The most common one is where theatricality comes in as a cipher for deviance or misbehaviour. So theatricality becomes a kind of policing mechanism about the boundaries of appropriate behaviour in the courtroom. And so it shores up particular forms of agency, who can speak, who can move, who can act, who can do, who is acting up, etc. That is not the only type of theatrical. You do have this body of literature, which is, I don't know, I struggle with it a bit because I find it a bit on the nose, but it's basically this kind of literature from the 70s in particular that develops the idea of the courtroom as a site of drama. And in this kind of analogy with theatrical, rather than using theatricality as a form of degeneration or saying it's a negative thing, they say, in fact, the trial, like certain types of theatre, elevate us in some kind of way. So the trial, like certain types of theatre, holds up a mirror to society or to ourselves, but they're very selective. When we're talking about theatre, we are not talking about a lot of theatre. We are talking about Aristotle, Shakespeare, Grotowski, Brooks' holy, like Grotowski's holy theatres. They're very selective about it. And so by doing that, they're kind of idealising both. So I'm going to suggest in the first half that it's interesting to learn what work that metaphor does. But I'm also going to say that neither of these approaches tell us that much about theatre itself. They don't really have a particularly deep understanding of theatre and performance studies as a discipline. So in the second half, I want to move into thinking about, if we do move beyond the more superficial analysis and we move beyond this metaphor, what can theatre studies and performance studies as a discipline give to us as legal academics, as criminologists, as criminal justice scholars, regarding concerns that are of importance to us? So, here I'm thinking about openness, thinking more deeply about role play rather than just saying it was a form of role play, so acting. And I think particularly thinking about the online courts and the use of technology and what that's doing to criminal trial proceedings. And I'm going to suggest that there is a great value in using theatre and performance studies language to help us articulate things that we might think is important but struggle to actually be able to put into words or to name. So, long preamble aside, let's see if I can get this right this time. I've done it wrong again, haven't I? Here we go. So, this is the Lowry Theatre in Salford, which some of you may or may not have been to. It's fantastic theatre. But as you can see from this image, it is set up for something that looks rather like a courtroom. So this isn't a production about a courtroom. This is a Nightingale Court. So as you're aware, during the COVID pandemic, they put Nightingale Courts into different places to allow them to, conduct proceedings. And I think it's a useful image to say that on the one hand, there seem to be superficial resemblances that make a courtroom and a theatre somehow analogous. Certainly on a practical level, enough to be like, well, this is a good place for a Nightingale Court. This must work in some way. On the other hand, though, we have this unease that somehow they're not the same. So Peter Murphy says, most of us seem to have an undefined feeling that there must be something wrong with acting in court, that the courtroom and the theatre must be different worlds. So I want to kind of pick that apart today to think about it. And I think the most useful thing to do is to go back to 1916 and think about a particular trial. So in 1916 in Nebraska, a man named Roy Roberts was accused of killing a man named Bernard Conant. They were both in their early 20s, and I think they were farmers or farmer assistants. I don't know a huge amount about this trial. I know that someone wrote a book about it, so I suspect it must have been pretty popular and must have been fairly well known. But what we do know is it was popular enough that the courtroom was full and more people wanted to get into this particular Lincoln County courthouse. And so because they had concerns about wanting to admit more people, and because they also had concerns about the safety of the building with as many people that were already kind of rammed in there, they decided that what they should do is move it to the theatre down the road. And so that's what they did. So they picked up the trial, they went to the Keith Theatre, and they conducted the trial there for a period of time. Unfortunately, I don't have any images of either of these things. So the Lincoln County Courthouse was pulled down and rebuilt, and I don't have an image of what it looked like. And the Keith Theatre too was pulled down and rebuilt. However, we do know, I can get this done slowly so I keep doing it the right way. There we go. We do know that the courtroom in question, this Keith Theatre, was built in 1908. And we know that it was also an opera house, and we know that it became a cinema before it was demolished. So this is the New Theatre in Oxford from 1892. And I'm taking a punt, it's probably quite similar to this, but this is the kind of style that was pretty commonly used. Well, you have this proscenium arch here. You have the backstage space, the actual stage forward. Sometimes you have more of a thrust stage, sometimes you don't. You have the spaces for the spectators down in the sort of stalls, but you also have these sort of balconies and galleries. Sometimes you have boxes, sometimes you don't. It's quite ornate. So I'm not confident, but I feel reasonably confident it probably looked something like this when Roy Roberts went on trial. So we also know that the court, the counsel, the jury, the witnesses and the officers were sat on the stage, and then the spectators sat in the audience. Right. At the adjournment of the court, on one occasion, the bailiff announced from the stage, the regular show will be tomorrow, matinee in the afternoon, another performance at 8:30. Court is now adjourned until 7:30. So the reason we know that Roy Roberts' trial took place in the theatre is he was convicted and he appealed. And on one of his grounds of appeal was that the courtroom should not have been moved to the theatre. And he said, quote, or the appeal said, it was, quote, prejudicial to the calm consideration of his cause to which he was entitled. So we have quite an interesting moment in 1916 where the Supreme Court, I think, in Nebraska, have to put their heads together and really think this through. Like, can you move a courtroom to a theatre? And if there is a problem, what is it about it that is actually the problem, right? So to jump away from it just for a minute and sort of come back to Roy Roberts in a second, we can see why I think you can see this superficial resemblances. And when I say superficial, I'm not saying that they're not genuine resemblances, but there are certain things that we can see in common. So I've mentioned before, we have these actors on stage, we have these spectators here, we have these kind of galleries and balconies. If we skip on, why am I so bad at doing this? Here we go, to this sketch. This is the Old Bailey in 1809, I think. And here, of course, I think of Linda and your work on courtroom architecture, thinking about things like segmentation and segregation. You have these divisions between these performers, if you like. You have sort of the bar table. You have, the rest of them. You've got the hoi polloi up in the galleries. You've got, these people who I think presumably are juries, people waiting to testify. You have these kinds of a sense of a stage with these judges. You have these costumes, symbols, etc. Going back to so the stage here, I think you talk, Linda, about circulation routes in the architecture, saying there are spaces and movements that are allowed for some participants and not others. So here an audience member, when they get up and leave, they're not going to climb on stage and walk out the back door. Like they have these sort of natural ways of dividing people. So in this respect, you can see that there are lots of ways in which there are these significant similarities. But I think the problem with this analogy is you understate the differences for a few reasons. So if we come back to Roy Roberts and his trial, the court does in fact allow the appeal, and that he is, unfortunately for him, reconvicted. But in the appeal, they basically say, look, the law requires that trials should be public, but this requirement is satisfied by admitting those who could conveniently be accommodated in the courtroom where the law requires the trials to be held, without interrupting the calm and orderly course of justice. However, when they actually talk about what bothers them, the issue they really land upon is the fact that the witnesses were all sat together on the stage. They sort of say that normally in the courthouse, they would have actually been separated from one another. They would have been separated from the proceedings to some extent, but the theatre doesn't have the amenities to facilitate that. They couldn't do it. So there were no conveniences at the theatre to enable the court to conduct the trial in the regular and ordinary manner. The rights of the defendant were prejudiced, and this was made necessary principally because of the unauthorised removal of the trial from the courtroom. So it's not the fact that it's a theatre, it's the fact that it's not a courtroom, and it's the significance of the difference between the two, despite their resemblances, that actually prejudices the defendant's rights. And I think one of the things that to me always stands out, particularly because I'm someone who's obsessed with laypersons, that's all I ever research about laypersons in legal proceedings, is that what you have in a courtroom, as opposed to a theatre, if you want to be a bit simplistic about it, is that in criminal justice and criminal trials, you have the participation of people within the trial who are not legal professionals. You don't have this distinction you tend to have in the theatre of actors and not actors, right? The closest analogy you have in the theatre is audience participation, which is by far the worst kind of theatre if anyone's ever experienced it, right? So you have this kind of these people, these witnesses, these juries, these laypersons, complainants, defendants, etc., who are not professional actors. And to me, that seems like a real fault line as well that kind of lays bare the problem with comparison. And of course, this comparison is based on a very specific moment in time. It's a very specific mental courthouse you've got and a very specific mental theatre you've got. And they're both not necessarily what either of these things look like. The comparison between the theatre and the trial tends to be happening around a time when when they say theatre, they mean a place that stages dramatic fiction, that has a clear stage and all the rest of it. Lots of theatres don't look like that, and theatrical practice certainly doesn't look like that. Anyone who's been to a punch-drunk production will know this is not what theatre is. Similarly, courthouses and what they look like have changed significantly. So the lofty 19th century architecture isn't necessarily the case. And we all know that magistrates' courts look nothing like this, which is what the majority of kind of proceedings look like too. So what I want to kind of suggest, I suppose, is to say that it gets you somewhere, but it also, I think, undermines too many differences that are significant. But to go back to our friend Roy Roberts, what I also love about this case is that what also comes out of this is this terrible anxiety about the problem with the theatre. So yes, they say it's about the separation of witnesses, and yes, they say, you know, it's not necessarily the theatre itself, but they keep saying stuff like orderly, calm, decorum. So one of the dissenting judges, who doesn't think the appeal should be allowed, says, the administration of justice ought not to be confused or confounded with shows and entertainments. The trial ought to have been conducted in the courthouse with the decorum becoming a judicial investigation where the defendant is on trial for his life. So it's this deep-seated uneasiness and queasiness about theatricality that puts together this idea that the courtroom is important, it's sober, it's about adjudication, it's about truth-telling and facts. And theatre is not just entertainment, it's mere entertainment. So it kind of sets up this relationship where the risk of doing something like having a courthouse in a theatre is that the courthouse will degenerate into mere theatre, which is, you know, what someone's explicitly said. So I have problems with this for obvious reasons, like, you know, of course I would. Firstly, it overlooks the very long history of trials as a form of entertainment. And once again, as Linda has written about, you know, the role of spectators is actually quite significant in, you know, in the trials, though you would not know it from the tales that legal professionals might tell about themselves and their history. So until we had better options like the White Lotus and Succession and the cinema, you know, we used to go to trials, and trials obviously used to be shorter. I think they're actually, you know, they're less entertaining for lots of reasons today, but we used to all go and watch trials. But of course, it also massively shortchanges the theatre and its potential and its purpose by saying it's, you know, it's frivolity, it's a, you know, whatever it is, it's vaudeville, it's Mamma Mia, you know. I mean, no shade of Mamma Mia. I haven't seen it. I'm sure it's very good. But, you know, it's basically saying that law is important and therefore the theatre is not. And so this takes us to what I said at the beginning, which is that the most common definition of theatrical, if you see what they're actually doing, is the more a trial is deemed theatrical, the more it's strayed from some implicit belief this particular person has about what the trial is meant to be or meant to do. These tend to be unstated goals, but whatever they are, they're irreconcilable with whatever the theatre is. So it's a dichotomy, right? So the trial is truth-telling, the theatre is artificiality and lying. And this is this deep anxiety. But this basically attitude only works if it's kind of in keeping with what Elizabeth Burns says about theatricality in the 1970s. And she says, you can only have a pejorative attitude about theatricality if you're implicitly making a sort of dichotomy between that and natural behaviour. There's natural behaviour and then there's what you think is theatrical. So this kind of idea says that what someone says is theatrical isn't a fixed theatre thing that is recognisable to all. It doesn't have the same thing. It is something that is determined by that individual as being not something it should be, right? So it doesn't tell you about that thing itself independently, but it tells you about this individual's perception about what is and isn't appropriate in a certain context. So that is what the theatricality is. So you get to stuff like this. I'm not very good at this, hang on a second. So the courtroom, particularly a trial courtroom, seems to be a forum for people who are so inclined to behave inappropriately, something about the theatre aspect of it. So this is Anita Blumstein-Brody and a number of other female American judges talking in the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law, I think. But see, when I see this slide, the thing I want to ask is, which people are they talking about? Who are these people that are inclined to behave inappropriately? Because it's usually not the lawyers. In fact, it's hardly ever the lawyers. Sometimes it's the lawyers. Mostly, though, it's laypersons. It is people like, sorry, Linda, you're getting some heavy usage here. This is from your
I'm glad somebody's reading my work.
your article on watching women, an illustration of courtroom scenes. I just think it's such a fantastic image. So we have this female spectator in court. I mean, in some ways, I feel like this comic is quite affectionate in some ways. But this is the vulgar woman who's speaking out of turn. This thing, she's sort of shouting from the gallery. So you have this kind of person would absolutely be a candidate for being theatrical or disruptive, as you go on to talk about. So this idea that spectators, other laypersons, are interrupting orderly conduct, interrupting the trial of proceedings. I think you mentioned in your article, Linda, the only reason we know about them is because they start shouting and then they end up being slapped with contempt, and that's how they end up in the record, basically. So yes, there's this kind of idea that they're not behaving as they should. And then you also get on the more kind of, why am I so bad at doing this? Is there a delay or is it just me? Sorry. Hang on. Sorry about that. So this is an illustration of Bobby Seale bound and gagged at his proceedings for the Chicago conspiracy trials in the 1970s. So the binding and gagging of defendants. And I mean, this is the 1970s, but I mean, I've just read about a judge in Florida who taped a defendant's mouth shut, I think, in the last year or two. And I mean, this is an explicit, you know, it's normally metaphorical, you know, the way in which we kind of silence and constrain the defendant, but obviously it does stray into the literal. But again, the people who are most ripe to being saying that they're acting up, behaving theatrically, are the defendants, right? Defendants are misbehaving, etc. They're straying from what they do. So yes, theatricality is a policing mechanism to undermine or ridicule the participation of laypersons in trial proceedings because they don't know the norms, because they are feeling constrained by their roles, because they feel that they want to actually communicate something, and this has to be kind of knocked down, if you like. They don't have the agency or the authority to speak, and therefore this becomes a form of theatricality. So Bridget Toy Cronin, who writes mostly about litigants in person beautifully and civil justice, but she talks about, you know, boundary work, saying this is boundary work. This is a way of reinforcing who can speak and who can't. So, right. That's the first and most common kind of conception of theatricality. But as I mentioned, there is another version, and this is the idealization stuff. So this is the stuff where writers compare criminal trial proceedings to certain kinds of theatre, and they sort of talk a bit about stuff that's a bit more akin to there we go, sorry, ancient Greek theatre, Shakespearean theatre, etc. So the most sort of one of the well-known examples is Richard Harbinger writes an article called Trial by Drama in 1971. That's quite influential. And he talks about how the trial is a play within a play, and it's a dramatic thing rather than a legal thing. And when he says it's a drama, he says there are two forms of drama going on. There's the play without, which is the two advocates within adversarial criminal trial proceedings and their particular kind of, you know, roles. And then there's the play within, which is the narrative of the alleged crime. And he says all of the trial is about conflict, and this conflict requires a resolution, and he uses the words catharsis. So the end point of the trial is a sort of a triumph or a tragedy, depending on the determination. So this is a very explicit kind of pseudo-Aristotelian construction of Aristotelian dramatic tragic theory, right? So in this kind of conception of what Aristotle is meant to be doing, I'm not an expert of Aristotle. There's a lot of debate about what Aristotle was doing, but you know, the sort of the general understanding of it is saying that you have a particular kind of plot where the audience is being hooked on a story that is designed to kind of evoke and purge their pity and terror, right? So it's about having an inevitable outcome, and it's about being driven by these particular vehicles of plot. So we'll come to a certain kind of ending. So by drawing on this theory, you're kind of foregrounding how important the storytelling of the advocates are, the power of the lawyer to kind of create this narrative, and the passivity of the jury / audience, who are kind of under the spell, if you like, of this particular enactment. So similarly, Ronald Sokol kind of picks this up in the late 70s and talks about how, you know, the essence of drama is conflict. And they sort of say that it's all about this resolution of conflict that is driven by the advocates. So Sokol actually goes out of his way to say that this is what drama is in the trial, as opposed to what is theatrical. And he says that it's drama when the advocates do it, but if the defendant gets on his soapbox to advance his political views, it becomes theatrical. So it actually kind of puts the two together. So hence theatricality is deviant, but drama is good, right? So Milner S. Ball, who wrote an article about theatre, so about unscientific, what's it called again? The Play's the Thing, sorry. A sort of famous 1975 article says, it's drama, but more than this, it holds up a mirror to legitimate society, the trial. It emphasizes it's got a humanizing dimension. Quote, judicial theatre performs and animates a fit form of decision-making for our version of democracy. Jurors who deliberate on these stories, quote, throw off the corrosive effects of our culture's devotion to the self and exclusive fascination with individual rights, and it's therefore allegorical. So it refocuses the participants' sense on a higher purpose, right? I feel like I'm sounding quite sarcastic, so I'm not really down with this, but I'm not trying to be dismissive of it. But there's a very particular science sort of thing coming out here. So John Gillespie goes on and says, okay, it's not Aristotle, but it's a medieval morality play. So it's an allegorical in structure. It has the teaching of lessons for the guidance of life. The principal characters are highly universalized types or personified abstract things, right? And Gillespie's like, well, you need to say that the trial isn't a theatre just because there's role play. That's not enough. He's like, well, if a football match has role play, and it would be absurd to call it theatre. But he says its structural similarity to the serious play where there is a, quote, political, philosophical or moral lesson, end quote. So it's didactic enlightenment for a jury. Yeah, so I could go on, but I think you've probably had enough and gotten the general gist of that. But yes, so there's this kind of trial by drama, which is good. And again, you know, for me, the most obvious thing that comes out of that is this kind of trial by drama. Oh dear, there we go. Is very much all about the lawyer, right? So the one thing that all of these kind of trial by drama share is just how dominant the lawyer is in all of these kinds of conceptions. So this is William Garrow, who some of you will probably know was a very famous barrister. I think became a judge later, I believe. One of the early kind of stars of the bar in its earliest incarnation. And the caption says, being nervous and cross-examined by Mr. Garrow. And I really like this because you can see, with the exception of this guy in blue who's looking somewhere else, most people are kind of just looking at him cross-examining this witness and all eyes are on him. He's in the center of the frame. And the witness looks very nervous and very stressed about the proceedings. But this conception of the trial as a passive audience really kind of focuses on naturalizing the dominance of the lawyer. The lawyer is who speaks, and the rest of us kind of, you know, are affected by the speak of that. So in that respect, you know, it ties into the stuff that John Langbaine talks about in his history of adversarial criminal trial, about this kind of shift we have to this dominance of lawyers from a time when we did more ourselves. So when I was doing my PhD, I had a lot of fun in the Old Bailey Online archives looking at the older trials. So this is a kind of example of what he talks about as altercation trials. So this is the trial of Susanna Broom from 1739, where she's kind of, you know, she's representing herself because there wasn't an alternative. And I mean, I want to preface this by saying I'm not saying this was a good thing. I mean, they were not having a good time. They, you know, they weren't allowed to swear. They weren't told what they were charged with. They were often pulled up from the floor in chains. This is not something that is aspirational. But certainly they spoke for themselves more than when the lawyer comes in and takes that particular role. So here the prisoner saying, did you ever see me take up any edge tool or scissors or knife to abuse him with? And the witness, Coombs, says that he's seen her beating his head against a sash window as they go along. And the prisoner says, fie upon you. He went to get a stick to beat me with, did he not? So you have a more active defendant historically who is now far more passive, and we have normalized the dominance of the advocate. And of course, the defendant these days. Oh dear, sorry, I should really be better at this. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Apologies. Looks a bit like Simon Cowell. It's not Simon Cowell, it's a defendant in a dock, but he said this is what the defendant looks like these days, right? You know, passive, enclosed in a dock. Again, so what kind of comes out of this then, if you like, is that theatricality also tells us about the historical kind of silencing of other participants. So in the end, all of this kind of comes back to this first half is saying that it polices the behavior of those who aren't behaving appropriately. It can elevate the dominance of the lawyer into being a form of moral lesson. But either way, I think it is quite limited into what theatre and theatre studies can be and can offer. But it is instructive about how, you know, legal professionals can see the trial. So to move on from theatricality, I said in the second half, I was going to think about what else we can do with theatre and performance studies. So what I'm going to stress we can do. Let's try and do this more effectively. So this, what can lawyers learn from actors? So this is the advertising from a 5-part DVD I made the University of Sydney Library buy when I was a PhD student. Sadly, I looked on YouTube, it's no longer there. So this is a couple of American actors who were touring seminars for years. I don't think they're still doing it anymore, but American lawyers and law firms would pay for them to come in and give them some acting skills and some techniques to help them improve their performance in the courtroom. And this guy in particular I see on television all the time. He's in everything. Anyway, lawyers as actors. Always fun to open this conversation because with the exception of some people in the US who will embrace that, most lawyers and particularly advocates will hate to be told that they're an actor. They'll be like, absolutely not. On the one hand, I think that goes back to what we've just said, you know, theatricality, artificiality, falsehood, etc. There's this kind of unease about saying what we do. But at the same time, there is clearly some kind of relationship between what advocates are actually doing in the courtroom and acting. So the degree to which people will explicitly acknowledge it kind of varies. So you do get stuff like Justice Edward Parry in the 1920s, who says in his 7 Laps of Advocacy, which I've got and I love, He says, quote, "The great advocate is like the great actor. He fills the stage for his span of life, succeeds, gains our applause, makes his last bow, and the curtain falls. Nothing is so elusive as the art of acting, unless indeed it be the sister art of advocacy." End quote. So there's something there, right? He sort of perceives there to be, it's not acting exactly, but there's clearly at least a familial relationship between what advocates are doing and what are acting. What I'm going to suggest is that lawyers are definitely acting, but it's because they don't really, when they say that they're not acting, they're not really necessarily understanding what acting might mean. So I want to suggest that we do want to say that lawyers are acting. So legal actors are trained, advocates are trained, they rehearse, they perform, they behave in a certain way that's within the conform, the expectations for what is appropriate for their role. This is a form of acting. The reason I think we're quite resistant to it is because when we say acting in the courtroom context, we tend to mean overacting, right? We tend to mean acting that deviates again in some way from what we expect. But it's important to remember, you know, acting has its own long history. So we have normalize what we would call naturalistic acting, right? So naturalism is a particular kind of performance style that kind of comes out of the 20th century. You have Stanislavski and the Moscow Art Theatre and this idea of an actor starting to merge into their character. Then you have, you know, Lee Strasberg and method acting and all these kinds of ideas that, to grotesquely simplify it, basically say that it's about neutralizing markers that make you who you are and disappearing into the role in a way that allows an audience to suspend their disbelief, right? It means that the fourth wall isn't interrupted, that you don't question that they are part of that particular role, that they just seem to be in keeping with what is appropriate, right? But if we went and saw, I don't know, Henry Irving, if we went back 150 years and we saw great actors at the time, I think we'd struggle to recognize it as great acting because we'd probably see it as pretty OTT, you know, right? So Diderot wrote an essay called The Paradox of Acting, and he basically said, in like, I think it's in the late 1700s, you know, great actors should be able to feel nothing and express the opposite of that. So they should be really expressive, but good actors felt nothing of it. It was meant to be a complete opposite, a paradox, the paradox of seeming to have all these gestures but not feeling any of it. And that was kind of, for him, the aspiration for actors. And obviously, we think completely differently now. We assume that what we're seeing is consonant with what's happening internally. So naturalism has its own specific theory. I'm going to suggest, and I tried to suggest in my PhD, and I'm still suggesting constantly, that what we might want to say that advocates do is we could call it legal naturalism. So legal naturalism as a performance style is a way of behaving in a way that would signal competence, skill, and honesty to other legal practitioners, to other triers of fact. The parameters of what is constituting this form will alter over time. It's not historically static, but it's something that you acquire through socialization, through education, through repetition, and it should fade into the background. You should just seem like you know what you're doing, right? This is what legal naturalism is, but it's a form of performance style. So Phillips really sort of says, look, every time an actor performs, he or she implicitly enacts a theory of acting, a set of assumptions about conventions and style which guide his or her performance, the structure of actions they perform, the shape those actions take, and their relationship to the audience. Informing these assumptions are culture-specific assumptions about the body-mind relationship, the nature of the self, emotions and feelings, and the performance context. Enacting these assumptions is as true for the student as it is for Sarah Bernhardt or Yoshi Oida. Each embodies specific theories and practices of acting locatable within a set of historical, socio-cultural, and aesthetic/dramaturgical circumstances. So the boundaries of what is appropriate advocacy is a form that I would call legal naturalism. It changes over time, so what is appropriate and isn't appropriate will not always stay the same, but it is something that comes through the induction and repetition of practice within legal process. So rehearsal, repetition, acquisition of skills, etc. And the reason why I think it's important to explicitly name it as performance is because I'm getting back on my hobby horse about litigants in person, which is to say that when people try and represent themselves, it isn't just restricted to that. When people try to enter into performing these kind of roles, like having to perform in the courtroom in some way, it's a perpetual source of annoyance to me how much they're denigrated as being poor performers, because it's assumed, I think, to some extent, that what legal performers are doing is kind of natural or normal. Like it's just, they're just doing something that someone who represents themselves should be able to read in the book and therefore reproduce. You know, here are these guidelines to how to represent yourself in court. Here are these things. Yeah, and if you read them, they're like, you know, you can see that it is actually about this kind of learned behavior, because one of them, I think it's the Bar Council guide, so something like, you know, you should stand up, but actually maybe you should sit down, or maybe you should say this, but maybe you shouldn't. You know, it's just kind of like, it really just depends, you know, it absolutely depends on this kind of social world in which you inhabit. So using the language of acting, I think it allows us to explicitly name these sets of skills that actually separate legal professionals from laypersons, and that this huge gap, you know, this barrier to effective participation. So that's one of my contributions for what acting can do. So the final thing I wanted to offer about what theatre and performance studies as a discipline can give to us is to think a bit about, excuse me, oh, what have I done? Video link technology, remote courts, etc. So if we think about theatre and say, well, it's not just a proscenium arch, it's not about this kind of 19th century vision, what actually is theatre? So Gay Macaulay says, you know, theatre as distinct from other media is essentially a relationship between performer, spectator, and the space in which both come together. So what is interesting about the theatre is that it kind of felt itself to be under threat in the 20th century. And again, I'm simplifying a bit, but like the criminal trial, people used to love going to the theatre. It was a very popular form of entertainment, but it has been very much largely displaced because we have film, we have television, etc. And so there's a kind of crisis, if you like, and there's need to articulate, well, what does theatre have that nothing else has? What's its unique selling point? And so you get this kind of articulation of what theatre is if you strip away all the extra stuff, if you take away the specific stage, if you take away the costumes, if you keep, what are you left with? And so what it comes back to is this kind of shared togetherness and something that happens in this particular way. So I've expressed that terribly, which is why I've got a quote from someone else who does it better than me. So Peggy Phelan wrote a book called Unmarked: The Politics of Performance, and she has a beautiful chapter called The Ontology of Performance, where she says a lot of interesting things, but she says performance's only life is in the present. Performance cannot be saved, recorded, documented, or otherwise participate in the circulation of representations of representations. Once it does so, it becomes something other than the performance. And she goes on to say, to the degree that performance attempts to enter the economy of production, it betrays and lessens the promise of its own ontology. Performance becomes itself through disappearance. So performance's essential quality is its liveness. It's that something happens that can't be captured but then disappears forever. The idea, again to quote from her, that a limited number of people in a specific time and space can have an experience of value which leaves no visible trace afterwards. So in the criminal trial and criminal trial proceedings in places like Crown Courts, we have a transcript. But of course, the transcript is not what took place. It is a account of some of it. But actually, the most substantial part of it is about this gathering together. So in this PhD I did many years ago, I said, you know, the criminal trial is predicated around us gathering together, that it's constitutively performative in that sense, that it relies on this shared space of people coming together. This is what theatre is, and this is what the criminal trial has certainly historically been fundamentally about. So we invest this liveness with an awful lot of power in criminal proceedings. We say things like demeanour assessment, we can assess whether someone's lying or not, we can determine what the appropriate outcome is, you know, the consequences are extremely high. We believe that we can do it better when we're there as opposed to when we're not there. And this is a really deep-seated and really long-standing belief. Right. I mean, the thing is, of course, that doesn't mean that we can. In fact, we probably can't. There's no evidence that will sort of compellingly, like, that says that we're actually better at reading people in person. In fact, we might, in fact, be a lot worse at it. But this belief is kind of inescapable, right? That we really kind of hang on to it. And this is what makes it so challenging when we think about what happens when we introduce video link technology. So we know from the research that's been done into the use of special measures, as well as the more recent stuff around remote courts, is that many people have a far better experience of, you know, criminal trial proceedings if they are given the opportunity to testify remotely, for lots of obvious reasons I'm going to come to. But we also know there's a deep ambivalence about how that's going to be received, that in fact it might there might be less likely to be believed because people retain the belief that if someone is telling the truth, either they're better able to assess it because they're face to face, or that if someone is telling the truth, they would come and to be confronted because it would have value in that respect. But what kind of comes down to, if you like, is a kind of circularity. You can't prove or disprove this fact, but you also can't dislodge this particular kind of belief, that there is a value to us gathering together. And this, I think, is what makes us feel so uneasy about remote testimony, that there is something that is being lost that can't be reproduced, that we value in terms of what is important in adjudicating. It's really important, though, to say that there are problems with this assumption too. I mean, as I said, you can't prove it, but so theatre and performance studies has also been very careful to say the problem with this kind of stuff is you start to idealize this kind of life process, right? And this happens, I think, in some literature about remote testimony, that you're idealizing these kinds of life proceedings. So I remember really vividly when I was studying theatre and performance studies, and we would talk about, you know, these transcendent moments of live performance, like if you've ever been to, I don't know, a festival or a concert or something, and suddenly the boundaries between you and the person next to you fall away. So where normally you'd be really annoyed if someone stood too close to you, you have these kind of transformative experiences where you kind of feel like you're one with someone else, you know what I mean? Like you all kind of merge into a crowd or anything like that. And I remember Ian Maxwell, one of my professors, saying, you know, I bet you the Nuremberg rallies felt great too. You know, I bet you that was the same kind of feeling. You know, there's nothing inherently fantastic about it. It's really powerful. It doesn't mean it's a powerful force for good, right? So Philip Alcindor in particular writes about this, saying we need to be very suspicious of this power of presence because it's, you know, it can be very questionable ideologically. It doesn't mean it's good. So what we have is this deep-seated belief that in fact leaves us in this funny position. So from a defendant's perspective, it's kind of it's a really difficult one. So once again, the criminal trial, to connect up with all the kind of sociology of law stuff, you know, is not a positive experience for very, very many people for lots of obvious reasons. You think about Peter Harewood talking about it's a grotesque facade to pretend that it's a voluntary form of participation for a defendant. You know, they have to pretend to acquiesce in this kind of grotesque drama. You think about, you know, Garfinkel talking about degradation ceremonies, that there is a kind of performance here and it is critical, but it's not necessarily a nice kind of performance. You know, it is a performance that is about exploiting this kind of liveness that often ends up putting people through a great deal of trauma, right? So it's not necessarily a positive thing. So you're, on the one hand, you're kind of better off with it because people might be more likely to believe you're telling the truth. But on the other hand, it's actually a very traumatic thing to go through, and technology might offer us kind of a way out from that. So it's quite difficult. And I think at least with performance studies and theatre studies, you can start to use the language to name this kind of symbolic value that we are very attached to. So theatre becomes anxious about its own legitimacy because it gets lost. And I think that legal process and criminal trial proceedings also feel anxious because without this kind of repetition of this performative enactment of the trial, this kind of, you know, haunted by past performances. So theatre scholars love to talk about, you know, ghosting in the theatre, that when you do a production of Hamlet, you've always had, you know, you're kind of speaking back to thousands of productions of Hamlet that went before you. The criminal trial also sits with this kind of, you know, this tradition of it being performed. So we don't want to lose that. It has meaning, it has significance, but it's not necessarily a great thing for people who are participating in it. So where does it leave us? I'm not against technology. I'm not a tech skeptic. And I think, you know, the criminal trial side have a great deal of suffering from many people. And I think using special measures, for example, could be really valuable. But I do have concerns. So, you know, I tried to get my head around this when I was writing a paper. And I came back to this idea that, you know, Emma Roden, who writes fantastically about online technology, she was talking, I think, about how a judge had said that if a defendant was being disruptive on a video link, they could just, I think they just turned them off. They either muted them or they switched off the screen. I can't remember the exact thing. And that made me think, well, Peggy Phelan says, you know, liveness, this kind of gathering creates this maniacally charged presence where anything can happen. And to me, that kind of promise, which brings with it the possibility of disruption for a defendant being disobedient, all the kinds of things that other people might not like, is still better than the kind of extension of control that comes from technology, where you have this possibility of turning people off, because you can't turn people off in the courtroom. And that seems to me to be quite important. I think it's a really unpopular argument because I'm not going to persuade any judges by saying, well, you want the defendant to be able to, you know, jump up and shout. You know, I feel like that's not going to sell it to me. But I think that's really important. And that's what I worry about disappearing. So it's not about having to say remote testimony is bad because the theatre of the trial is sacred. I think it's about saying it's really problematic, but we have this deep-seated belief. And until we're willing to talk about it, we're not going to be able to articulate what we think we're losing. And if we use, I think, impoverished terms like orality, we're going to fail to be able to make a case for why it might matter. That's it.
Thank you very much. Well, Floor's open.